Okay, before we start, let me just change that to this to that, and also give a mandatory content warning on how this video covering the second issue of Watchmen with its adaptations features 3 versions of 2 instances of violence against women. I expect the people familiar with the comic and the 2009 movie at the very least to be aware of this. But since YouTube is what it is these days, I felt it necessary to bring that up before moving on to Absent Friends. On the day when Edward Blake is given a military funeral, which is attended by Adrian, Dr. Manhattan, and Daniel, Lori decides to skip that to instead visit her mother in her retirement home in California. Unlike how Lori, who is still bitter, her mother Sally is nostalgically looking back to her days as the original Silk Spectre, back when Blake was still alive and active as the comedian. Lori, with her more modern views and values, is more disgusted on her mother's memories and mementos, which include a Rule 34 comic on her heroine identity. And that leads to the flashback set when the portrait of the Minutemen was taken. Before that infamous thing we all know already happened during it, we have some character establishing dialogue about why they are not sent to Europe back in the 40s. And then the comedian is shown attempting to sexually assault Sally when she is changing outfits. Blake's dialogue implies that he was one of those
"She was asking for it by dressing like that"
perverts before he was caught in the act by Hooded Justice, who started beating him up. But the comedian endured by calling Hooded Justice a who gets off from beating people up. The flashback ends without Hooded Justice helping Sally up from the floor, and rather telling her to get up and cover herself on her own. After getting another hostile exchange between the mother and daughter, we move to the funeral where Adrian is thinking back to another flashback. This is from when Captain Metropolis of the original generation of masked vigilantes had set up a meeting with the next generation and unite them into a crime busters team, with the comedian in its attendance. The meeting was to set up those partnerships for the vigilantes to work together, starting with going after a resurfaced villain named Moloch, and with Nite-Owl and Rorschach mentioning that they had worked against gangs. But unfortunately this initiative never got properly off the ground, thanks to the comedian himself having called it all meaningless first to Ozymandias' face, and having caused a destructive scene that made everyone attending it to walk away. The next flashback, after quickly reminding us that we are at a funeral, is told from Dr. Manhattan's point of view, from when he and the comedian had guaranteed the United States a victory in their war with Vietnam in Saigon. The unmasked Edward Blake downplayed their victory in calling it as another bad joke on top of another, especially when President Richard Nixon only decided to just arrive on the first chopper after the ceasefire. Blake, on the other hand, wanted to leave on the next chopper out, and the reason for his hurry then arrived in the form of a local pregnant woman, whom he had been involved with and was the father of her child. As he has been established so far, Blake had no intentions of starting a family abroad, and told this to the poor woman as directly in character as he could. And as the woman's scorn did not take his rejection lightly, she gave him a physical reminder of her, to which Blake then responded directly by shooting her, killing both the mother and her unborn child, while Dr. Manhattan just watched it happen without trying to intervene with it. Blake ranted back at Dr. Manhattan on everything he could have done to stop the entire scene from happening, before leaving to see a medic to patch up his face. Next, we see Daniel's flashback, set before 1977 during the police strikes, that eventually led to the Keene Act which outlawed masked vigilantes. While Daniel as Nite-Owl in his owlship tried peacefully to tell the writing populace to stop destroying public property, Blake as the comedian in a new face mask covering his scarred face, immediately responded back by throwing a tear gas grenade into the crowd to disperse them. Nite-Owl commented on the situation by mentioning that Lori and Dr. Manhattan were doing the same thing in Washington, while Rorschach was at another part of town. Comedian responded to that by calling Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan as the same crazy lunatic as his old Minutemen colleague Byron Lewis, who got committed to a mental institution. Nite-Owl was shocked at the comedian declaring himself to be more clear-headed than them, while shooting rubber bullets at protesters painting a graffiti on the wall, and questioning what has happened to them and to the American dream. Comedian answered that it became true, and they are looking at it in all the chaos around them as the flashback ends. In the present day, Blake's funeral draws to a close with someone discreetly leaving roses to his grave while everyone else is looking elsewhere. This person leaves as quickly as he arrived and returns to his home, where Rorschach, having followed him, identifies the man as Edward William Jacoby, a former masked villain Moloch who used to be an enemy of the comedian. Despite that, he still attended Blake's funeral in having learned his identity a week before his death, when Blake had broken into Jacoby's apartment unmasked and drunk. Among his ramblings, Blake accused Jacoby as Moloch for having been accomplished with something because his name was on a list with his own, along with Dr. Manhattan's old girlfriend, Janie Slater. He also mentioned seeing something from the window of a plane on an island where after infiltrating it he saw something including writers, scientists, and artists doing something that witnessing it made the comedian, who had hurt women and children, to break down into tears and come crying about it to one of his old enemies. Rorschach takes Jacoby's story for now and leaves him with a warning for having illegal drugs, which he learns to be used to treat his terminal cancer. On his way back to the graveyard to visit Blake's grave, Rorschach thinks about Jacoby's story, how valid it could be and how much it could matter. In the end, Edward Blake, who had spent 45 years of his life as the comedian, is dead, killed in a violent fashion like his former colleagues, Dollar Bill, Silhouette, and Captain Metropolis. As Rorschach has come to understand, unlike them, Blake as the comedian had understood the flaws of the world he existed in and tried to cope with it through the humor of being a parody of it. A joke that no one else was able to get. In Rorschach's own experience with that kind of humor, he knew a joke about a depressed man coming to get help from a doctor, who, unable to prescribe any medication, recommended him to go see a visiting clown in town to cheer him, only for the punchline to be that the depressed man was that visiting clown, who begins to cry at the doctor's advice. They say never speak ill of the dead, but this issue seemed to want to take what Laurie said about Edward Blake in the previous one, and use it to shove that saying down to where the sun doesn't shine. Indeed, the way how our main characters remember Blake at his funeral makes the way how he died look too good for him. But then you also take notice at the people in the background around the comedian, and come to realize similarly as how he did in Jacoby's flashback, that everything Blake did had a point. Before I explain that further, I need to make clear that his actions are not acceptable, but with Rorschach viewing them as Blake attempting to be a parody of the world he saw, they start to make uncomfortable amount of sense. Like, let's take the first flashback as an example. Blake forcing himself onto Sally is what we are meant to focus on and disapprove of. But how does the Hooded Justice respond to it other than just pulling him off her and giving him a beating? This is set in the 1940s, And even in the 1980s when Alan Moore wrote it, he acknowledged the deliberate values dissonance of that era, and how the worst kind of men would have responded to women dressed like Sally as Silk Spectre 1. The heroes that the other Minutemen were would not have treated Sally as Blake did, but they must have had thoughts about acting on them. The fact that the Hooded Justice looks down on Sally after having come between them and does not help her, but rather tells her to go cover herself on her own shows how he and the others must have really been looking at Sally as a scantily clad woman. And not just her, because before Blake came at her, we heard them talk apathetically about the ongoing World War II, in rather focusing on small-time street-level crime back on the US soil, which Sally seemed to be bitter about as a Polish woman along with the Silhouette, who, by the way, got kicked out from the Minutemen when she got outed as a lesbian woman. Sally in the present day also does not share the animosity towards Blake that Lori as her daughter does, but that is more relevant to talk about in the later videos. Anyway, those are the values of the people Blake wanted to parody as the comedian, which he also does call out Captain Metropolis on in Adrian's flashback, on how he wants them to continue fixing small problems back home instead of going to do something about the impending nuclear war with the Soviet Union, which he knew would have been nothing because they were just men and women in costumes who couldn't make that difference. Captain Metropolis is also the one who kicked Silhouette out from the Minutemen. Then there is what he does in Vietnam to that pregnant woman, which again is unacceptable, and something that Blake may have known to be an overreaction with how he could have handled the situation differently if someone had stopped him. That is how and why he instead ended up blaming it all on Dr. Manhattan, who had all the power in the world to stop the escalating situation from ending up as it did, but instead decided to watch how it concluded. As much as Blake was a jerk towards the woman in making her attack him in retaliation, what does that say about the most powerful man in the world when he chooses to watch and allow the situation unfold without trying to stop it from getting worse? Especially with what we learn in later issues about how his powers work. By the time we got to Daniel's flashback in the late 70s, Blake can only revel in the chaos, because we could assume that nothing has changed from his perspective as the world is burning around him. Or just that everyone stopped trying to hide who they were and acted exactly how Blake saw them as the comedian. It didn't and couldn't, however, have lasted long for him to keep up with it, as suggested by Jacoby's testimony of Blake's visit to him. As a man in his late 60s, he had ended up pushing everyone in his life away from him, and had only his former arch-enemy to talk about something that had broken him. That works both as the deconstruction on how people like Blake would end up friendless and alone, as well as a new way of providing clues towards the real reason on why he was killed the way he was. All in all, those were the surprising layers in this second issue of Watchmen, not just on the comedian, but with everyone else as well, that I had not even properly acknowledged on my previous read-throughs, and so were there when I looked down at what I had written. It's also something for you in the audience to think about, but there isn't much else to say about this issue on its own anymore, so let's move on to the adaptations now.
What the hell happened to us? What happened to the American dream? What happened to the American dream? It came true. You're looking at it.
In the 2009 movie, Edward Blake's funeral and the 5 flashbacks remembering him alive are contrasted with a few changes. Starting with showing how people are arriving there in a musical montage playing Hello Darkness My Old Friend. We are also shown instead of told how Lori arrived to her mother Sally's retirement home in California. Then there is how Sally, played by Carla Gugino, is shown to have aged relatively better in her body and mind than her comic book counterpart did. Although that could have been because Carla Gugino was 38 years old at the time, and the movie decided not to recast Sally for when she was young and old, unlike how it did with Hollis. Also, Sally seems less nostalgically fond in grieving for Blake's passing by delivering the
Poor Eddie
line more with bitter sarcasm. As for the flashback set in the 1940s, there is no longer any dialogue about how the Minutemen should be sent to fight in Europe after their group shot is taken, and during Blake's attempted sexual assault on Sally, we have Nite-Owl 1 present when Hooded Justice pulls Blake off from Sally, likely to acknowledge how Hollis was there to bear witness to write about it in his book. Sally was also never pushed on the floor, rather on the table, so she is no longer told to get up and cover herself by Hooded Justice. Next up we have Adrian's and Dr. Manhattan's following flashbacks flipped out to have the latter be shown before the former, aka in non-chronological order. In the following issues, the fourth one to be exact, Dr. Manhattan dates these two flashbacks so that the Crimebusters/Watchmen's founding meeting would have happened in 1964, and he was asked by President Nixon to take place in the war in Vietnam in 1971. Then there is how Adrian's flashback has him replace Captain Metropolis in leading the meeting, which is weird, as Captain Metropolis was cast with Daryl Sheeler and shown in Sally's flashback to exist as a character. This could have been an attempt by Snyder and Hayter to make Adrian more involved and connected with the other characters in the story, or it could have been a similar situation of the actor not being available, like 4 years later in Man of Steel, with how Henry Cavill had to fill in for Dylan Sprayberry in the tornado scene as a teenage Clark Kent. Meaning that they likely rewrote the scene, with Ozymandias taking over Captain Metropolis' role in it. Then when it comes to Dr. Manhattan's flashback set in Saigon, Vietnam, President Nixon arriving there after the declaration of a ceasefire is cut out, and Blake's confrontation with the pregnant woman is portrayed with him like it's something he knows he has to begrudgingly talk with her before leaving, rather than wanting to avoid her altogether. She still ends up disfiguring him with a broken bottle, while Dr. Manhattan is slowly responding to the situation and actually raises his voice in calling out the moment he shoots her, as if a small sign of humanity in him that unfortunately made him forget about his own powers. Blake also stays to tell Manhattan off for everything else he could have done to stop him, rather than walking back and forth as he did in the comic in calling out for a medic. Daniel's flashback, set in 1977, then shows that Blake was not disfigured as badly as in the comic, as he is still wearing the same domino mask as before. He is also shown to hold himself back more than in the comic by not throwing any kinds of grenades into the rioting crowd, and instead jumping into the middle of it to use good old fisticuffs against them, before then opening fire on them with hopefully rubber bullets shot from his shotgun. Daniel as Nite-Owl does try and fail to stop Blake from shooting at graffiti artists in the movie, unlike how he just stood and watched him shoot at them in the comic. Actually, Patrick Wilson's performance in this scene is something that I appreciate in how it shows Daniel as Nite-Owl being one of the genuinely heroic characters who wants to do good as a masked hero. But he does not have the same confidence to take over the situation in contrast to Blake as the comedian, and works better when partnered up with other characters like Rorschach previously. He also sounds genuinely shocked in asking what happened to them as heroes and to the American dream, in showing how his dream come true in having taken over as a legacy character has become too much to handle. Then when it comes to Rorschach confronting Jacoby, played by Matt Frewer, in his apartment, before which we see Jacoby being more careful in having left his roses at Blake's grave after everyone else has left, and Rorschach does not jump at Jacoby from his refrigerator. Instead, he shoves Jacoby in there when ambushing him. And then there is Jacoby's flashback/testimony of how Blake broke into his apartment, which does not have Blake mention having seen something from the window of a plane on any island, which is a legitimate adaptation-made plot hole, as without it we do not have the foreshadowed trigger of what broke him and made the comedian come spilling his guts to his former arch-enemy, as he himself calls it in his ramblings.
Here I am, spilling my guts to one of my arch enemies. Shoot, this is the closest thing to a friend I got. What the fuck does that say?
And after leaving Jacoby off with a warning for having illegal cancer medication, the events of the second issue go pretty much the same as it did in the comic. So let's next focus on how the 2024 animated movie managed to do the same.
What happened to the American dream?
It came true! You're looking at it!
Well, once again, this adaptation is visually more faithful to its source material, but it also ends up making changes for the sake of being adapted in a separate media and to pace with its runtime. Like I said in the part 1 video, 3 out of the 5 flashbacks were shown during the events of issue 1. Daniel's first after Rorschach left his home, Adrian's after Rorschach visited him, and Dr. Manhattan's after he sent Rorschach out of his and Lori's home. For the pacing reasons, this could have been to show them thinking back to the previous times they had seen Blake alive after hearing about his death, while it also mixes their order of being told. At least Adrian's flashback still has Captain Metropolis doing what he tried to do in the comic. Dr. Manhattan acts as passively as he did when Blake shot the pregnant Vietnamese woman in his flashback, and Blake is wearing a full face covering mask following his disfiguration in Daniel's flashback. Sally, voiced by Adrienne Barbeau, is portrayed as the old woman she was in the comic and looking back to her past with what I would assume to be the
I used to be a looker
kind of fondness.
What are you doing with this creepy pervert art?
Oh, just some old memorabilia. Being reminded that people used to slobber over me is kind of flattering.
When looking at what she used to look like in her flashback and what she looks like in the present day of 1985. The 1940s flashback is told pretty much the same as in the comic, but like the 2009 movie, it also cuts out the talks about the Minutemen going to Europe to participate in World War II. And Sally is not told to pick herself up and cover herself by hooded Justice, who actually shows up to her rescue much faster than in the comic or the 2009 movie, because Blake apparently decided to go after Sally when the Minutemen were still in the next room. It's almost like this version of the comedian wanted to get caught. Then Rorschach confronting Jacoby, voiced by Jeffrey Combs, goes as it did in the comic, including how Rorschach, when learning about Jacoby's cancer, saying that he is going to deal with the company distributing his illegal medication instead of him.
Wrote down name of company. We'll report them later. You're off the hook for now. Stay out of trouble.
That then leaves me to compare how Jeffrey Dean Morgan and Rick D. Wasserman portrayed Edward Blake as the comedian before ending this video. Jeffrey Dean Morgan is obviously the better actor performing the character, while Rick D. Wasserman's voice is trying too much to match the comic Blake's character. I like to believe in the philosophy of "it's funny cause it's true", and true to his name as the comedian, Jeffrey Dean Morgan portrayed Blake with the attitude that he saw the humor in everything he saw and did, which then sold better how he was broken by the time he came to pour his heart out to Jacoby. In contrast, Rick D. Wasserman portrays Blake as the comedian more one-dimensionally to the point, where you can barely tell the difference between before and after he has reached his breaking point. And even then he comes across like he is trying too much, even when it's contrasted with the animation mimicking the comics portrayal.
What happened to the American dream?
It came true!
It came true!
You're looking at it!
You're looking at it. It's a joke.
It's a joke.
I thought I knew how the world was.
I thought I knew how the world was.
Mother, forgive me.
Forgive me. Forgive me. Forgive me.
This contrasts with the 2009 comedian acting more humorously with how he sees the world being a complementing improvement, and the 2024 comedian being more serious in delivering the truth as facts to faithfully match with the source material. This oxymoron could be one of those things that Alan Moore said that he did with Dave Gibbons, that can only work in a comic and does not translate well into other media. Considering how Alan Moore sees comic book superheroes and superheroes in general as a childish pastime that shouldn't be taken as seriously as they are taken these days, the comedian in Watchmen could have been an early harbinger of Moore bringing out those views, and as the self-aware character seeing that putting on costumes did not make any proper difference to the world, his death kickstarting Watchmen might also double as shooting the messenger. And another realization that I just came up with while writing this script. Okay, I want to end this video before my mind gets blown in a more literal sense by thinking too much about this. I have already written down the story commentary for issue 3, so unless something stops me from writing the review and the comparison to it, and I won't be taken to a psych ward with a third eye, the next video might still come out in September. Mandatory reminder on how YouTube works. Like this video, comment what thoughts you have about this issue of Watchmen, and if you agree or disagree with me about the comedian, share this video for more people to see, and subscribe to my channel to be aware when the next video is coming out. Also remember to ding the bell for when I will be doing gaming streams for a chance to chat with me, and may your heart be your guiding key.